So I'm Caitlin. I'm the person who Pete mentioned as his colleague, and it's actually nice for him to be the imposter in the room, because normally when I work with Pete, I am the imposter in the room, because I am a transport person. And today I'm talking about crowdsourced data. And I should say, before I became an academic, I was a transport planner. And one of my first appointments when I was a transport planner was to work with our bicycle and pedestrian committee. And when I went to talk to my friend, the transport modeler at our group, he looked at me and he was like, well, collecting data on motorized modes is pretty easy because cars, trucks, rail, they all have to move along particular paths. So we can instrument them to collect data, which is great. And we've got number plates, and we can track those, and that's great. And we've got extensive investment in collecting data on motorized modes. So, lucky you, you're working with active transport, and that is hard. Because travel patterns are irregular for cyclists and pedestrians. If you're walking somewhere, you don't necessarily stay on the pavement, right? You go the shortest path, or the most convenient path, or the path that takes you in an area that's well lit, or where you're not going to get quite as damp. Although in Aberdeen, that's a lost cause. Seasonal variations are extensive. You know, at one point we were doing a pedestrian and bicycle count in Kansas City where I was working, and the day that we had blocked off to do this count, it was pouring rain. We got almost no data, and yet that was the count day, so we were stuck with that. There's also just generally not as much funding available for counts of active travel. It's not something that we include quite as much. And the methodologies are really error-prone. I mean, we know, again, we have all these problems with manual counts. We know that people underreport their active travel trips in household travel surveys, because they tend to be shorter. We just forget about it. Magnetic detectors aren't necessarily great. If the detector is here, and I walk on this side of it, you're not going to capture me. Sorry. Again, self-reporting intercept surveys, it's just not great. So traditionally, our models have just underrepresented active travelers. It's not been great. And that's problematic because when we try to get funding for active travel, if I can't go up to an elected official and say, look at these beautiful figures that we have, they're going to say, why should I give you any money for your projects? So it's difficult to argue for funding for active transport based on traditional cost-benefit analysis because the data just aren't there. It's also hard to design good infrastructure. If we don't actually know where people are traveling, how do we decide where to make our investments in cycling, in pedestrian infrastructure? Because just because it's the shortest path, which is how we would often make our decisions, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best path. You know, I don't like turning across traffic without a light when I'm on my bike. So I take longer paths to avoid that, and I'm not the only one who does that. And finally, there's this idea of normalcy. So when we promote active transport, which we do, as you can hear, I am American, you don't want me driving. But for that to be the case, we really have to make active travel and active transport very normal, and we want to encourage it. And part of the way that we do that is to be able to show people, yeah, people are doing this all the time. And having accurate counts of how many people are walking and cycling makes it much easier to actually do that. And happily, it's becoming far easier to actually gather that data. Instead of having to collect data on the system, we're able to start collecting data on the person, which has actually been a huge boon to active travel planners. So it's mostly because of smartphones. They have GPS, GSM, Wi-Fi, accelerometer data. You can get really good information on where people are actually traveling instead of on the network through which they're traveling, which is quite handy. Smartphones, of course, are widely available. How many of you don't have a smartphone? Thank you. They're cost-effective for collecting agencies, partly because most people have their own. So you ask someone to download an app, or you gather data from somewhere else. They're multimodal. You can use them whether you're driving, walking, cycling, scootering, kayaking, llama riding. Don't think anyone does that, but if you do, They're familiar to users, they have a variety of sensors, and data can be collected actively or passively. You can just have something running in the background and collect data while that's running, or you can ask people to actually tell you what's going on. And in all of that, Strava has become one of the biggest organizations, agencies, companies that's been used to collect data. So it's an app-based social fitness network, primarily used to track cycling and running activities using GPS data. And the Metro program makes aggregated and de-identified data collected through the app available to organizations for a fee. For many of us, we look to the Urban Big Data Center, which we have a representative here, to allow us access to some of that. So what does it look like? You've got core data that gives you minute-to-minute data on cycling and pedestrian trips, along edges, streets, nodes, or intersections, and then the origin-destination data for all the trip pairs. You've got roll-ups for the street intersections, which gives you a pretty nice summary of data on monthly use, weekend, weekday, some basic demographics, and you can add tourism if you want, so information about the user's actual home location. I've got a not terribly wonderful visualization of some of what you get, but when it comes down to it, it's pretty detailed. It's reasonably accurate, and it's certainly better than what we had when I was working as a transport planner those many years ago. So is it useful? That's where the question comes in. On the whole, absolutely. Is it better than nothing? Yes. But it's primarily used by athletes and active travel enthusiasts, so we do have some concern about its representativeness by things like age, ability, gender, and income. There's some really good papers on that. I'm trying to get my undergraduate student who was working with some of this to work on publishing her paper, but definitely very similar to this. And those biases can be really concerning. You know, if I'm cycling in London, my cycle trip will be very different from that of my nephew, who is 10. You know, he is not as confident a cyclist as I am, and he will make different decisions, or his parents will make different decisions. The other thing is that my 10-year-old nephew isn't going to have Strava running on his smartphone because my 10-year-old nephew doesn't have a smartphone, so I'm not going to have data on him. And those biases can be concerning because those route choices, if we're trying to use data like Strava data to supplement, to augment what we're normally collecting, we may miss out on some of the people who aren't represented in that area. However, a large number of studies are finding that Strava data can usefully augment more traditional forms of active travel data. Again, is it better than nothing? Yes. Perfect? No. So what can we do with it? It can usefully be incorporated into our transport models, and again, can help us address some of these key gaps in our modal data libraries. It does begin to overcome that issue of simply not having data available. We can't look at it to stand alone, though. I mean, for one thing, there are issues around Strava and questions being raised because of things like privacy, because of the way that data are aggregated. You know, I'm sure many of you have seen the stories about Strava being used on military bases, and then those military bases being identifiable, because the only people who are using Strava in certain places are the US Army. So it should be used to augment rather than supplant traditional household surveys. But again, these questions about public perception, so things like privacy, things like considerations, concerns about public perceptions of the use of this data, people saying, I use Strava and I don't really want you to sell my data to be used for this, really shouldn't be ignored. And that's it. Thanks.